Hi, ladies. I hope the semester is going well for you and that you're getting excited about Thanksgiving. I know I am. This week we're talking about chapter 18. Before I talk about that, though, I just want to cover what will happen the rest of the semester. So there's basically 3 weeks and then the final. So this week you're doing a discussion and a quiz. Next week you have a paper due. The following week you have the last discussion, and then the final exam will happen. The final exam will be roughly the same length as the midterm was, and it will mostly be about the information that you've studied since the midterm. However, there will be at least one question about each book in the Bible, so that would include the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles. So let's talk about chapter 18. So basically, chapter 18 is about the Catholic letters. That's what we call them, Catholic with a lowercase c. That word Catholic means universal. So these are letters written to the large, group of believers at this time. And the letters are named for the people who wrote the letters instead of who the letters are written to. All the rest of the letters are named for who they're written to. The one exception to all of this is the letter called Hebrews, which I'll talk about in a minute. And all of these letters we assume are pseudonymous, meaning that although they claim to be written by John or Peter or Jude, that those were people using their names as pseudonyms to give their letters or their writings a little bit more clout. Another thing that's true about all this group of letters is that we call them epistles or letters, but a lot of them aren't really following the format of a letter. They offer a different voice than Paul, so all the other letters were either written by Paul or claimed to be written by Paul, and these give a new perspective. Also, these were the last pieces of writing that were accepted into the New Testament, and mostly they're letters that are trying to give hope to people who are losing hope, and mostly they're losing hope because of two things. One, that obviously the Parousia is going to be more delayed, and two, the persecutions to some degree have begun. And of course, we imagine those persecutions to be constant and to be life-threatening to all Christians, but the truth is they were really more sporadic, and some of them were very local persecutions versus, government persecutions. So the people who they're writing to are people who are struggling to fit into society. They're having trouble because they're trying to follow their Christian morals and values, and yet the rest of society doesn't adhere to them or believe in them, so that's a challenge. And I think we experience that same challenge today. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each letter, but of course you're going to read a lot more about them in the chapter. So the first letter is the Hebrews letter, and this is a letter that's kind of an advice for people who are considering leaving the faith or potential dropouts. And it's kind of like a long sermon. It's written more like a sermon. So it's a very long argument for why Christianity is preferred to Judaism. It also kind of discusses this duality between heaven and earth, and that Jesus was like this great mediator between heaven and earth. And there's lots of different theories about who might have written this: Barnabas, Priscilla, someone named Apollos. But most theologians don't think that's the actual authors, and that Origen, who was a church father, said that only God knows who wrote this book. The next letter is the letter from James, and this letter has been pretty important to the Catholic Church because we don't really agree with St. Paul in the rest of the letters that you're saved by your faith alone. And so what James says is that it's a combination of faith and good works, and that he says faith without works is dead. And so that expresses more from a Catholic point of view how we see what you need to do in order to be saved. So it claims to be written by James, but the author doesn't really mention much about Jesus or knowing Jesus. And of course, James was one of the apostles, and the scriptures say the brother of Jesus, although we as Catholics mostly believe this just means that they were really close. He also says that temptation and suffering doesn't come from God. Those are human things. God himself is perfect, And he says you have to talk the talk and walk the walk, meaning that you have to do what you say. And so to do what you say, you need to practice patience and self-control and seek true wisdom. In 1 Peter, some people think, or it says in the letter anyway, that this was written by Peter through Silvanus. Silvanus was one of the people who traveled with Paul, also known as Silas. And so there are some theologians who actually do think Peter dictated this letter. But again, Peter doesn't really talk much about knowing Jesus, and Peter was one of the closest to Jesus. And so this letter tries to explain why we suffer, which of course is a question we've always asked. Why do good things happen to bad people? And he says that people in the midst of suffering need to hold fast to their faith. And it may have been, someone writing down a sermon that was used at a baptism or at different baptisms. 2 Peter explains that while we're waiting for this delayed parousia, that we need to do that without sinning. Some people were acting like, well, Jesus isn't coming again, so we can do whatever we want. And he's reminding them that sin has a consequence. And he also talks kind of in language that's pretty fire and brimstone, saying that the current place at this time was going to burn and be consumed by fire. There's 3 letters that are written by John. Again, this was probably not the Apostle John, but maybe the Johnian community. And we know from these letters that community who preached about love and relying so much on love had splintered off, and they had some conflict. So this letter is kind of addressing the conflict. So it's also battling some more teachings about Jesus. Some people had come along to say that Jesus was really more spirit, that this spirit had inhabited a human while on earth, but had not experienced any real suffering. And so this might have been a kind of Gnostic group. Gnosticism was an early Christian heresy who basically said that about the nature of Jesus. And these people adhered to a belief called Docetism, which was kind of a belief that the spirit took over the human form of Jesus. 2 John is kind of like a PS to 1 John, or may have been sort of a prequel or like the cover letter maybe to 1 John. But it's only 13 verses long, and it says that it's written to the lady chosen by God. And it warns people about the Antichrist, like we need to be careful about the devil in human form taking people away from God. And then there's 3 John, who was addressed to someone named Gaius, so this is written to an individual person. And he's basically being kind of passive-aggressive in this letter because he's praising Gaius for being very hospitable and welcoming to people. But while he's doing that, he's basically criticizing other people who hadn't done that. And specifically, there's a person, Diotrephes, who he's probably criticizing by praising Gaius. And the last letter is the letter to Jude, or from Jude, sorry, not to Jude, from Jude. And he seems to be responding to some preacher who's come and passed on some heresy or some lie. And it is written like a letter, but it's in an invective letter, which means that he's basically yelling at them. He's using verbal abuse and insults. And people are asking the question, if God forgives all sins, then why does sin even matter? You know, a lot of people kind of have that attitude, like I can do whatever I want because God's going to forgive me. But Jude is pointing out that if you do sin, that you're basically a slave to sin, and that there will be grave punishments for those who sin. And he brings up things like the plagues, and he points out past punishments for people. So I hope you enjoy reading about these additional letters, and make sure you're working on your paper and getting ready for the final.